Hi guys, I wanted to talk to you today about a topic that's pretty near and dear to me, and many of you have expressed interest in this, and it's Chromasthesia, which is a really cool musical concept in which color and music collide. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that process and about what goes on and how that music and color are connected, and kind of take you through the path through history back from the 1930s clear until what we know today. Next, please. The umbrella term synesthesia governs what is then specifically chromasthesia. So synesthesia is the larger term, and then there are all these other connections that come below it. The Oxford Dictionary says the production of a sense impression relating to one sense or part of the body by stimulation of another sense or part of the body is by definition synesthesia. So you could taste a food and see a color. You could see words and think of a taste, if you will, just those multi-sensory connections. That's the umbrella term. Next slide. Chromasthesia is then the very specific term that relates music and color. Type of synesthesia in which a musical stimulus provides or produces a color sensation. So you hear a pitch, and suddenly your brain sees color. Or conversely, you think of a color, and your brain processes a musical pitch. Next. Here's a tangible, practical application of synesthesia, because sometimes it's hard to understand this. I have jawbreakers, and I'm going to pass them around, and you can take one, and just take the whole bag and pass them around. Everybody gets one. You can choose your favorite color if you'd like, and choose quickly, because they're going to go around kind of quickly. Don't open them just yet, because we're going to take a look at how that is connected to synesthesia. Everybody's getting those? Excellent. So many of you chose your jawbreaker based on the color. But in choosing the jawbreaker based on the color, you also chose it because of a flavor. So you know by looking at the jawbreaker that a certain color produces a certain taste, which is a very simple synesthesia thing. If you picked a yellow one, how many folks picked a yellow one? Great. You probably suspect it has some connection to lemon, or you got stuck with a jawbreaker that maybe you don't want. If you picked a purple one, I think there's one purple one. Somebody get the purple one yet? Anybody? Nobody? When you get the purple one, you probably suspect that's going to taste like grape. It seems pretty natural. Everybody grab the red ones. A couple folks grab the red ones. Thoughts on what that might taste like before you even taste it? Cherry, right? And cherry is pretty accurate. There's an orange one. How many folks got the orange one? Okay. Thoughts on what that's going to taste like before you even taste it? Orange. And then there's also a green one. Anybody get the green ones? Good. Thoughts on green? This one's maybe a little harder. Lime or mint or some kind of connection. So by seeing those, you've already decided to make a decision. Those of you that got to choose which ones you want, you got to make a decision of color and taste without actually tasting that. They could all taste the same, but you made a decision based on what they look like and what they taste like. So that's kind of a simple synesthesia. Next, please. We talked about chromasthesia, and there are two schools of thought. There's one school that says you're born with chromasthesia and hearing music and sounds together, and there's another school that says you actually learn those traditions and techniques. So if you take a look at the hereditary aspect, if chromasthesia is based on being born and genetic, then you can't actually learn colors and music, which I think is pretty sad if you think about it, because there's no way to experience that realm. Critical periods, however, are what are contained in the literature, and they seem to tell us that there are time periods where people are open to having music and color collide. If you look at the other side experientially, those folks say that learning is based entirely, that connecting color and music, based entirely on how you're integrated with sound and color. But some of the literature says that can't possibly be true because it's all hereditary and it can't be learned. So we kind of have this problem. Next slide, please. What do we know about chromasthesia? Here's what we know kind of in a basic way. There's a lot of brain activity involved. And in any event, any research that involves the brain, we simply don't know as much as we think we do. As smart as we are, we don't yet have an idea of how much brain is involved. We don't really understand how the brain connects it. The brain is involved psychologically, but there may be other conditioning factors involved. Next slide. These are some really cool people, and many of those names you may recognize throughout history as being either folks that possessed a chromesthetic ability, that is hearing music and sound together, or hearing color and sound together, or folks that wanted to investigate that because they thought there was a higher connection. And we'll go through a couple of these. Quick slide, please. So the artists, Kandinsky, associated sounds made by instruments with certain colors, and Paul Klee used temporal and rhythmic aspects in his paintings. So they're infusing music into that color scheme. Next slide. Scientists Newton, Kepler, and Helmholtz, they sought connections between individual pitches and hues on the color wheel. So they thought there was some color-music connection. Whether they had it or not, they assumed it was there. Next slide. Goethe, color and music are both referable to a higher formula, like two rivers which have their source in one and the same mountain. So they are two parts of the same thing, which I think is fascinating. Next slide. And then we get some of the composers, and this is kind of the cool part. Next slide, please. This is Scriabin, kind of a funny-looking guy. Scriabin was a chromesthetic, so he heard music and color very intimately. Wrote a piece called Prometheus, in which there is a part written for colored lights. And we still have yet to figure out exactly what he meant, but during the course of the piece, there are notes that are assigned to an instrument that produces a color. It's kind of called a light organ. We can't figure out how that's supposed to work, and so we can't replicate that piece. But everything he did was connected to music and color. Next slide. Messiaen, French composer, big into bird song, so would hear birds and kind of incorporate that bird sound into his music. He was also chromesthetic, so everything that he heard was connected to a color. So if you listen to Messiaen's music, the bird sounds that you hear have specific color influences as he's writing the music. Next slide. Rimsky-Korsakov, one of the great composers, who is fantastic, a chromesthetic as well. All of his pieces involve some sense of music and color colliding. His Flight of the Bumblebee, which many of you probably recognize, is all about a color. It's not necessarily about a bumblebee. It's about the color of what that bumblebee flying sounds like. Next slide. Hector Berlioz is one of the great chromesthetic interested composers. We don't know for certain that he had chromesthesia, but do know for certain that he was into hearing sounds and colors in a number of pieces. He went outside one day in his Symphonie Fantastique, wanted to incorporate the sound of thunder in his music, and so listened to thunder and then came back and wrote it all down on a piece of paper, obviously in his score, so that thunder has a sound, and when you hear thunder, it has a visual component too. Next slide. Claude Debussy, the French composer, big into the Impressionistic period, where color and sound collide, at least in all of those composers. If you think of Impressionistic paintings, it's all about how color is used. And Impressionistic composers will have that same color and music connection. Next slide. So what may contribute to chromesthesia? Here's the cool part. Modern research is contending that perhaps it's more learned and conditioned than actually hereditary. And we have, of all people, perhaps Fisher-Price to thank for that. How many of you remember at some point in your lives playing on one of these instruments, or seeing one of these instruments, or having a relative that has one of these instruments? We don't necessarily think this is, at the time, some chromesthetic connection, but if you look at it from low to high, there are colors on those pitches. And so research has shown that early exposure to these kinds of instruments tend to produce some color sense in some people. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Very important to notice that this top C is red, which is different than the bottom C, which is a different color. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And there are all sorts of color schemes, which is why we'll talk in a little bit. No two people hear music and color in the same way, because these are now different constructions of those same colors. Also, I have just a couple of those bath toys that float and have the little bars. Same kind of thing. These are all different colors than the other two devices you saw. And they kind of affect that color sense. You'll also take a look at the television. Media has a large role in how we see color, as well as those little alphabetic magnets that you maybe had as a kid where you spell words in the refrigerator and all the letters have a different color. Same kind of connection there. Next. So if those are contributors, then there's more, I think, to that conditioning and learning color and music than there is to heredity. Next slide. So just a couple kind of interesting things. not all cases of chromesthesia, but many of them, participants that possess that ability, the pitch C to them is either red or white. There is no other consistent thread among pitches for the majority. There are many people that don't hear those the same way, but if there was one pitch that has some consistent thread among all those people, it's the note C is usually perceived as red or white, which I think is fascinating. Next slide. Chromesthesia theories from 1933. These are really cool, and they're really funny, and they're really wrong. And part of the reason is in 1933, chromesthesia was seen as a disorder and a disease. Hypertension, hysteria, and manic and depression, those were all symptoms that kind of rolled into chromesthesia because we didn't understand how the brain works. The association theory says that we associate colors just with things that are kind of random and by chance. So walking down the street and I see a squirrel and the squirrel's brown and suddenly brown has become what I associate a squirrel with. So if you see a gray squirrel or a white squirrel, that messes with your brain because brown is squirrel. The degeneracy theory suggests that at some point in our lives, chromesthesia is a flawed system before our brains developed fully into understanding how to separate color and music. Compensation theory, which is fascinating, states that, in a sense, chromesthesia is a weak sense. So there's a weak sense that's made up by one of the other senses that's stronger. So let's say maybe, I don't know, hearing is maybe not so strong, so color takes over and does some of the work that the hearing does. Psychoanalytic theory is all Freudian. It simply says, in that Freudian way, that boys' experiences and girls' experiences growing up shape who they are, and that's how chromesthesia is developed. Vibration theory, certain notes produce certain vibrations, and those certain vibrations are the same as certain colors in the visual spectrum, and that's the connection. Emotional tone theory essentially says that there are certain pictures and images that make people feel good, and when they associate those with colors and color and music, and it's kind of an interesting triangle. Sensation form theory is kind of a three-pronged effort that works into emotional theory as well, that says you receive a certain sensation and you've connected music and color. Sensory reflex theory is kind of interesting. It says that chromesthesia itself isn't a thing, but it gives you the impression that it is a thing. So in that sense, let's say you see a note, you see a color, you don't really see the color, but your brain has been tricked into thinking the color is connected to music. Next slide. Here's an example of some chromesthesia that I've studied with a couple examples from last year. In the first case, you can see that that C is uniform, so that C is always heard as white, which we talked about, red or white. And then in the second example, you can see that the perfect pitch or the color sense is heard in thirds. There's one set of color hearing that happens on the way up a scale, and then one set of color hearing that happens on the way down. So just take a look at those for a little bit, noticing some similarities. You'll notice maybe earth tones that move up and then more prismatic that moves back down. Next slide. Here's what those two experiences, very different, have in common, essentially. Pianist, violinist, singer-songwriter, music, involvement in music at the college level, first musical experiences, big, on piano at age 3 or 4, between the two. First formal music instructions, 5 or 6, 3 on the other side. Absolute pitchability, also known as perfect pitch, so they both possess perfect pitch. Here's music as individual colors with individual notes. Then here, that you just saw on the bottom, thirds are heard as colors. Chromesthesia based on a scale of C. C is the starting pitch, also for the same for both cases. Language is used to describe color hearing. It's very colorful, so there's a colorfulness to color hearing. In the second case, it was difficult to articulate precisely what those colors are because they were hard to pinpoint. Next slide. So the critical items, the 4 things that are usually necessary for some color connection. Early musical study in that 3 to 6-year-old time range. Piano usually is the first instrument, is the one that produces the most color. And you can imagine with those instruments that we saw that that's pretty prevalent. Possession of absolute pitch or perfect pitch. And then music viewed as a way to express emotions. And all 4 of those generally fall into play as chromesthesia develops. Next slide. So possession of absolute pitch is the prerequisite for chromesthesia, right? So if you have perfect pitch, there is a possibility that you could develop a color connection. As we look at research later and further down the line, If it were possible to learn perfect pitch, either through color or through some other acquisition vehicle, then those both would be open to someone. Someone that had a chromesthetic connection could then perhaps acquire perfect pitch. Or someone that had perfect pitch and acquired that could then develop chromesthesia. Next slide. These are really cool and scientific and brainy, literally. So, brain scans of tone and word activations. It's kind of fancy. I'll talk you through it. In this case, this is sounds that are presented to brains. These are words that are presented to brains. On the right side are the controlled subjects. So those are subjects that don't hear music in color. On the left side are the synesthetics. Those are the ones that have that chromesthetic connection and can hear music in color. Fascinating. If you look at what happens when music is put into earphones, which parts of the brain are activated? Those that don't have chromesthesia, it's kind of all around the brain. Those that hear music as color, it's all on that left side, which is kind of fantastic. If you look at the bottom, then those that have chromesthesia as words are being put in their heads, and this study was German words. Not sure what the level of the German was that went into their ears. But you can see in that sense that German and those words are processed throughout the brain. And in someone who doesn't hear music as color, hears words on that same side. So there's a kind of a language connection between music and color that you get in the synesthetic or chromesthetic brain that you don't get in someone that doesn't have that. Next slide. So how does it all work, right? Next slide. There's no single consistent color experience for everyone. Imagine being at a party. Not everybody has the same birthday. Not everybody has the same like in food. It's the same thing with color. There's no single color experience. But those that do see music as color tend to have that same experience over and over and over again. It's not just today this note is yellow, tomorrow it's a different color. Next slide. So types of synesthesia in music, we'll talk about these just a little bit. Gravitational synesthesia, if you can imagine a piece of music, say for piano, that starts at the top of the register and kind of meanders its way down, there's a sense that in that synesthesia, that the higher pitches are lighter and the lower pitches are darker. If we look at comparative synesthesia in music, that would say that low sounds are darker, high sounds are lighter, shorter sounds are brighter, longer sounds are darker. So there's that kind of connection. And then chromesthesia, which is actually connecting pitches, whether it's pitches or chords or keys as individual color areas. Next slide. Subtractive color wheel. So invented by Johannes Itten. These are colors, and pretty much how color is perceived. We take colors away, and that's how we go around the circle. And you'll notice that it starts at yellow, but it could start anywhere because it's a circle, so you could start at any point and move around. So take a good look at that. Next slide. Circle of keys. It's kind of subtractive. If you subtract fifths or add fifths, you kind of get that same sense. Next slide. You notice anything similar about those two circles? They all have 12 points, right? So there is a theory that states that the 12 subtractive color wheel colors relate to the actual 12 chromatic pitches that we look at in terms of a circle of fifths, circle of keys. Next slide. Visualizing those slightly, putting colors on the wheel, we start to connect some dots. So that, next slide, there's a color system. And this is a very popular, copyright 2011, very popular circle of keys that's out there for pitches that connects pitches to colors. And if you'll notice, many of the pitches as they come around are the same color when they go into the minor wheel. So something interesting to think about. Next slide. Here's that same thing laid out potentially from C all the way up to B. So you can see that the color wheel works in that same way, which means if somebody were able to hear a specific color as a specific pitch, they'd be able to identify it, and then there could potentially create a perfect pitch situation. Next slide. Carl Seashore, 1930s, one of the early researchers into chromesthesia, suggested that those who were blind from birth had no color sense. Therefore, no color music connection was possible because they couldn't see to justify what those colors were. But if someone had sight at birth and lost it at some point, their color sense could be heightened and could be amazingly connected. Next slide. Color works most vibrantly when it's in the presence of darkness. And we'll do a try it yourself example, okay? I want you, keep your eyes open. I want you to think of the color blue. Dark, rich blue. Just think of it, kind of see it in your brain. Excellent. Now close your eyes, and I want you to attempt to see that same color. And you'll probably notice that when your eyes are closed, that blue is way more vibrant and way more exotic, and perhaps even in 3 dimensions. You can open up your eyes. Anybody have that experience where the blue becomes a little more intense when you close your eyes as opposed to just visualizing? That's kind of Seashore's thought, was that when eyes are closed or there's this darkness in front, the colors are heightened. Next slide. So, connecting music and color. Next slide. We're going to look at the note E flat. Okay? Think of E flat. Think of it in your brains. Hard to imagine, perhaps. So here's E flat. Next slide. I want you to hear that pitch is green. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to hear it. And I want you to hear that note and all of the sounds associated with it as being completely saturated in green. The most beautiful green you can imagine. Okay, keep your eyes closed. Is that pitch green based on what you've just envisioned? Probably not. Open your eyes real quick. Next slide. The note D. Next slide. I want you to hear is the pitch yellow. Close your eyes again. So again, this vibrant yellow that washes over that note. Okay? I want you to open your eyes. Next slide. The note C. Next slide. Red. Eyes closed. Allow it to kind of wash over you. Okay? Hopefully you're seeing it. Eyes open. Next slide. So as we listen to pitches now, attempt to connect the colors that you hear with the sounds you hear. What color is this? Anybody? It's green. How about this one? Anybody? Red. And that's the other one, yellow, right? So, let's mess with your brains a little bit. It's kind of wiping the slate clean. Eyes closed. Think about that first color sensation that you got from each of those pitches. Does it have a color? And if so, what color do you see? And shout it out is fine. Yellow. Good. After all of that clearing the slate, that sensation of color is connected to pitch, at least on a small level. And you can articulate the color, assign it to a pitch, and then identify the note. Kind of interesting. Next slide. If you could connect the color to pitches, you have a better chance of identifying the notes. And imagine if you could connect every pitch that you hear to a color and have it so infused in your brain that you hear a note and out comes a color. I think that's pretty cool. Next slide. What might such an experience look and sound like? Next slide. Carolyn Hoyle is a contemporary visual artist, recently had an exhibition in Greeley. She listens to classical music while she paints and then paints what she sees. Her exhibit was What Music Looks Like, where she took a bunch of pieces that she's listened to and painted them as she's listening to them. And I thought it'd be interesting for you to take a look and see what music could look like, especially if you know the pieces. We don't have time now to listen to each of the individual pieces, but we'll take a look at what she envisioned kind of as we close out today. Next slide. So Vivaldi's Four Seasons, spring, and she didn't list a specific place in the movements that she listened to, so we just have to assume that it was some part and maybe even the whole thing. Next slide. Summer. And a lot of that paint that you see at the bottom is actually three-dimensional on the canvas. Next slide. Vivaldi Four Seasons, she labeled it fall, which is typically not how we describe that piece, but I kept her titles in just for interest. So that's what fall looks and sounds like to her color-wise. Next slide. Winter, You kind of have a winter sense there. It feels cooler maybe than the other ones. Next slide. Stravinsky's Firebird. So very busy, very active, very musically charged and color charged as well. Next slide. Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. I think this one, especially for me, feels really connected. Like I can see the Rhapsody in Blue just in that painting. Very excited, very jazzy, and that blue sense. So it's kind of, again, connecting jazz sense. Next slide. Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody. It's not clear which Hungarian Rhapsody she was listening to, but if you think of Hungarian Rhapsodies by Liszt, kind of busy and very Hungarian, obviously. And that seems to connect pretty well, I think, with those colors. Next slide. Concerto for 2 Violins by Bach. Really interesting. If you think as one side as being one of the solos and the other side being the other solo, all connected down the center, that painting is essentially grooved, as if you had animal claws and just kind of grooved your way through it. Next slide. Brandenburg Concerto No. 4, which actually has, at least for me, a sense of Salvador Dali, if you know his artwork. Kind of looks like that. Next slide. So a Messiaen piece, The Kiss of the Baby Jesus is the title. Messiaen, a color chromostat that we talked about. So that's kind of the visual impression that Hoyle got from that painting. Next slide. Beethoven Symphony 5 that we spent a lot of time looking at. Interesting. It's busy, but does it reflect what Beethoven 5 sounds like in your brain? I'll let you be the judge. Next slide. O Fortuna from Carmina Burana. You can see kind of some of the rhythmic elements that express themselves in the painting. Next slide. Tchaikovsky's Capriccio Italien. So the Italian sun kind of bursts forth. Next slide. Also Sprach Zarathustra. This one's kind of interesting. If you know the piece at all, it's used as the 2001 Space Odyssey movie. And so there are little spaceships in there. So there's a visual component from movie that meets color component as well. Next slide. The Khachaturian Saber dance. So there's a lot of that busyness in that piece. Next slide. Pines of Rome. So very green, thinking trees. I also see this thing here as a tree, potentially. So that's kind of a visual, not only visual, but here's a visual that's connected to an actual item that's a tree that's green, kind of thing. Next slide. This is a piece by Romero. I don't know the piece, but it's pretty busy. It looks pretty exciting. Lots of extraneous things that are happening, so it's probably a pretty busy piece. Next slide. The Bach Brandenburg concertos in totality. Hearing those all as very segmented individual movements as well as a certain style that goes along with it. Next slide. Joplin's Ragtime. So again, it just looks like jazz, doesn't it? It has that feel to it, like a color connected to jazz. Next slide. Respighi's Fountains of Rome. This one's really interesting. It's meant to be aquatic, obviously fountains, and all of these are sequins that are then painted into the painting, which is pretty cool. Next slide. Appalachian Spring of Joplin. Again, very organic piece that has lots of levels and layers that you can see in the piece. Next slide. Quiet City, it's a piece for trumpet and English horn. It's a solo by Joplin. And there are those 3 impressions of what that piece sounds like. Next slide. And then finally, this is the Concierto de Aranjuez by Rodrigo. Again, her title isn't usually how we display that, but it's kind of like beadwork in this kind of mosaic something. So hopefully this was just a teaser to get you interested in connecting music and color, and we'll continue to explore it in the sessions that come, and hope that this was informative and that you learned something today. Thank you.